A dark night. Linda, a young woman of unwavering spirit, had just spent an evening with her closest friends, laughing and dancing beneath the twinkling village stars. It had been a carefree night, filled with the warmth of companionship and the music that echoed through the open air. However, as the clock struck late, Linda felt it was time to go home. Her heart longed for the comfort of a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, where she would be safe, away from the noise of the night. The rain had begun to drizzle, creating a soft mist that hung in the air. The alley she walked down was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of her boots against the wet cobblestones. She glanced at the end of the alley where her house was just visible, the faint glow of her lantern shining like a welcoming beacon in the distance. But tonight, something felt different. As Linda continued walking, a faint sound echoed behind her. It was barely perceptible at first, a soft patter of footsteps, too quiet to be sure of its source. She paused, looking over her shoulder into the empty stretch of alley. The silence was oppressive, but when she turned back around, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The footsteps had stopped. Probably just my imagination, Linda muttered to herself, continuing her walk with a slightly quickened pace. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling creeping up on her. But then, she heard it again. Louder this time. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, someone was following her. Linda's heart skipped a beat, and she hurried her steps. She glanced behind her once more, her breath catching in her throat. The alley seemed to grow darker with each passing second, and the distant sound of footsteps continued to grow closer. Panic started to creep into her mind. It couldn't be her friends, they were already gone, heading their own ways. Her eyes scanned the shadows ahead, her senses heightened. And then, as a flash of lightning illuminated the alley, she saw them. Two figures. Tall, broad-shouldered men, their faces hidden behind dark masks. They moved with precision, closing the gap between them and Linda, their footsteps growing louder with each stride. They had been following her for a while, and now, it was clear they had no intention of letting her go. Linda's breath quickened, her chest tightening with fear. The men were too close now, their heavy footfalls deafening in the silence of the night. She felt a cold chill run through her body, and without thinking, she bolted. She ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her ears, her legs burning with effort. But the alcohol she had consumed earlier began to take its toll. Her vision blurred and her feet felt heavy, her movements sluggish. She could feel them gaining on her, their pursuit relentless. Linda's foot caught on a loose stone, and she stumbled, falling hard into a muddy ditch. Her hands scrambled to push herself up, but the rain-soaked ground was slick, and she couldn't get a good grip. The figures loomed closer, their steps now deafening in the silence of the alley. Help! Somebody, please! Linda's voice cracked, but the men were too close, and her scream was swallowed by the night. One of them reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly from the ground. Desperate, Linda kicked and struggled, but the men were too strong. She could feel the cold steel of a knife brush against her skin as one of them tied her hands behind her back. Her heart raced as she tried to break free, but it was no use. Her vision swam with dizziness, and before she knew it, she was being dragged away into the dark, the sound of the men's breathing heavy in her ears. As they pulled her down the alley, her mind raced, fighting for clarity. Where were they taking her? Why were they doing this? The fear coursed through her veins as she realized that the worst had only just begun. A desperate struggle. The cold metal of the van's interior pressed against Linda's back as the two masked men shoved her inside. Her hands were tied tightly behind her, and her legs were forced into an unnatural position, causing sharp pain to shoot through her body. She tried to move, but the ropes held her fast, and the fear of the unknown washed over her like a tidal wave. The van's engine roared to life, and Linda could hear the tires crunching against the wet gravel as they sped away from the village, taking her further into the night. The men said little during the journey, their faces hidden beneath their dark masks. Linda's mind raced with thoughts of escape. She strained against the ropes, trying to loosen them, but they were tight, too tight. Every bump of the van sent jolts of pain through her body, and her stomach churned with fear. Where were they taking her? What did they want? Her heart pounded faster with each passing minute, her breath shallow and quick. The van finally slowed as it approached a desolate, isolated spot near the river. The sound of the water rushing nearby made Linda's stomach turn. She had no idea what awaited her, but she could feel in her bones that it wasn't going to be good. Without a word, the men roughly pulled her from the van and dragged her toward the riverbank. The night was silent, save for the rushing water and the distant calls of night birds. Linda fought against them, her mind clouded with panic. She kicked and struggled, her feet slipping on the muddy ground. But the men were relentless. They were stronger than her, and she was too weak to fight back effectively. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" One of the men grabbed her by the shoulders and spun her around, his grip tight and unyielding. "Quiet," he hissed, his voice muffled by the mask. "You're not going anywhere." Linda's breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to break free. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, barely able to stay on her feet. Her fear turned to desperation as the men continued dragging her toward the river. She had no idea what they intended to do with her, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going down without a fight. She fought back with everything she had, twisting and kicking. In that moment of chaos, as she struggled against the man holding her, her hand brushed against his mask. With a sudden burst of strength, she yanked it off, revealing a familiar face, Malusi. Her mind went blank for a moment as recognition struck like a bolt of lightning. Malusi. She had known him for years, a childhood friend, someone she had trusted. But now, here he was, part of the darkness that had come to destroy her. Her heart raced as she tried to process what was happening. Why was Malusi doing this? Why had he turned against her? Before she could demand answers, the other man grabbed her from behind, shoving her toward the river. She was too weak to resist, too scared to think clearly. They had her cornered, and there was no way out. "Please, no," she screamed as they inched closer to the water. "I don't deserve this." But the men ignored her pleas. They prepared to throw her into the river, her body tied and helpless. Just as they lifted her, the sound of a voice, loud and commanding, broke through the darkness. "Stop right there." Linda's heart leapt in her chest as she turned her head toward the source of the voice. Through the rain and the mist, a figure appeared on the riverbank. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a determined look in his eyes. He was a fisherman, Saifo, known for his skill on the water. Without hesitation, Saifo charged toward the men, his voice full of authority. "Let her go." Saifo shouted as he lunged at the men, his strength overpowering the one who held Linda. In the chaos, Linda was released, and she fell to the ground, gasping for breath. She scrambled away from the water's edge, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Saifo fought with the men, his movements swift and precise, as he managed to knock one of them to the ground. But the other man, Malusi, hesitated, his eyes filled with uncertainty. It was a moment of weakness that Saifo seized upon. With a powerful swing, he knocked Malusi aside, sending him stumbling into the mud. The other thug quickly fled, retreating into the night. Linda lay on the cold ground, her body shivering uncontrollably. Saifo crouched beside her, his hands gentle as he checked her pulse. "You're safe now," he said softly, though his eyes were filled with concern. Linda tried to speak, but her voice was weak, barely a whisper. Why did they do this?" Saipho didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the safety of the riverbank. He laid her down gently, his hands trembling as he began to perform CPR, pressing on her chest and forcing air into her lungs. It was a desperate attempt to revive her, and his heart raced with fear as he walked. Minutes passed before Linda coughed, her body convulsing as water spilled from her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, but the world around her was a blur. She tried to speak, to ask who he was, but her vision faded again, and she slipped into unconsciousness. Saipho stayed by her side, his heart heavy with worry. He couldn't leave her like this, not after everything that had happened. He carefully lifted her again, determined to take her to safety. "Hold on," he whispered. "You're not alone. I won't leave you." And with that, he carried her through the stormy night, praying that she would survive the horrors she had just endured. New beginnings. Saipho's arms ached as he trudged through the muddy path, Linda's fragile form cradled carefully in his arms. The rain continued to pour relentlessly, soaking them both, but Saipho barely noticed. His focus was solely on getting Linda to safety. The sounds of the river rushing alongside them and the occasional crack of thunder felt distant in his mind. He had to make sure she survived. The journey felt longer than it should have. The path to Saipho's humble home was a small, narrow trail that twisted through the trees, and he was desperate to get there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lights of his small cabin came into view, warm and welcoming against the cold night. Saipho pushed open the door with his foot, stepping inside with a sigh of relief. His home was simple, cozy, and smelled faintly of wood and the sea. He gently laid Linda down on his small bed, covering her with a blanket. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering flame of a single lantern. Saipho quickly lit a fire in the hearth and set about gathering some water to wash Linda's wounds. He was no doctor, but he knew enough about first aid from his days on the river. He walked quietly, cleaning the cuts and bruises that marred her skin, gently applying ointments to help soothe the injuries. His movements were tender, a soft contrast to the storm raging outside. Saipho sat by her side, watching over her with unwavering care. He had no idea who she was or where she had come from, but there was something about her, something he couldn't explain, that made him want to protect her. Her beauty, her spirit, and the way she had fought so desperately against the men who had tried to harm her, he admired her strength. He hadn't expected to be thrust into such a situation, but now that he was here, he wasn't going to leave her side. Hours passed, and Saipho barely left her side. He prepared a simple meal, hoping that when Linda awoke, she would have the strength to eat something. He kept a quiet vigil by her bedside, watching the rise and fall of her chest, waiting for the moment when she would open her eyes. Finally, as the first light of dawn filtered through the small windows of the cabin, Linda stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she blinked against the bright light of the morning. It took a few moments before she fully regained her senses, her eyes scanning the room as she tried to sit up. Saipho quickly moved to her side, gently placing a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice reassuring. "You're safe here." Linda looked at him, confusion written all over her face. "Where am I?" she asked weakly, her voice hoarse. "You're in my home. I found you by the river last night," Saipho explained, his voice calm and gentle. "You were in trouble, but I brought you here to help." Linda stared at him for a long moment, as though trying to process what he said. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if something was missing, something important. "Who am I?" Linda whispered, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. "I can't remember anything, not even my name." Saipho's heart sank. He had feared this would happen. The trauma she had suffered, the near-death experience in the river, the kidnapping, could have been too much for her mind to handle. He didn't have the answers, but he knew someone who might be able to help. After a quick breakfast, Saipho took Linda to the local village doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Zola, who had seen many strange cases in her time. The journey to her clinic was short, and Saipho spoke as little as possible, unsure of what to say. He wasn't sure what Linda had gone through, and he couldn't understand the confusion she was feeling. All he knew was that she had a long road ahead of her. Dr. Zola greeted them warmly when they arrived, but her face immediately turned serious as she examined Linda. She checked her pulse, her eyes scanning the young woman's face as she observed her reactions. Linda sat on the examination table, still looking lost. "I don't remember anything, doctor. I don't even know who I am," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. Dr. Zola gave a sympathetic nod. "Memory loss is a common result of severe trauma," she explained to Saipho. "The mind can block out painful memories as a defense mechanism. It's possible that Linda's mind is protecting her from something too difficult to face." Linda looked at the doctor, her expression one of confusion. "But I'm not just forgetting things, am I?" she asked. I feel like I'm not even myself anymore." Saipho watched with concern as Dr. Zola continued her examination, taking notes and asking Linda a series of questions. Eventually, she turned to Saipho with a solemn expression. "She may have what's called dissociative amnesia," Dr. Zola explained. "Her mind may have blocked out her past to protect her from the trauma she's experienced. But the good news is, with time and care, she can regain her memories. The process will take patience and support." Saipho nodded slowly, processing the doctor's words. "What can I do to help her?" he asked. Dr. Zola gave him a reassuring smile. "The best thing you can do is offer her stability. Give her a safe place, and be there for her as she heals. Her memories may come back slowly, and it might be painful when they do. But with time, she'll remember who she is." On the way back to Saipho's cabin, Linda was quiet, her thoughts distant. Saipho could tell that the uncertainty was weighing heavily on her. She didn't know who she was, and that left her feeling lost, as if she had no place in the world. But Saipho was determined. He wouldn't abandon her. He would help her find her way again, even if it meant walking beside her every step of the way. "Thank you, Saipho," Linda said quietly as they reached the cabin. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Saipho smiled softly. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." As Linda sat down by the hearth, Saipho felt a sense of calm settle over him. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain: he would help Linda rediscover herself, one piece at a time. Secrets and lies. Linda's days began to pass in a blur of comfort and confusion. As the weeks wore on, she started to settle into Saipho's simple life. His humble cabin became her sanctuary, a place where she could heal and grow stronger. The warmth of the fire, the smell of fresh fish he would catch in the river, and the quiet rhythm of Saipho's daily routines gave Linda a sense of peace. It was more than she had known for a long time, and for the first time since waking up with no memory of her past, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Saipho treated her with kindness, never rushing her, always patient with her struggles. And as the days turned into weeks, Linda found herself feeling less like a stranger in her own body. The pain of the past, though still distant and foggy, seemed easier to bear with Saipho by her side. They spoke often, mostly about his fishing expeditions or the changing seasons, but sometimes they spoke about the little things that made life worthwhile, the simple pleasures like enjoying a meal together or watching the stars by the river. Despite the warmth of their growing bond, Linda could not ignore the nagging emptiness that lingered within her. Her memories came back in flashes, small fragments, like pieces of a puzzle, but they were never complete. Her name, her past, her family, these things still eluded her, and every time she tried to piece them together, it felt like she was searching for something that was lost forever. Saipho, too, began to feel the weight of curiosity pressing against his heart. He found himself wondering more about the woman who had stumbled into his life. Who was she really? Why had she been attacked? What had driven her to the river, and what dark forces were behind the attempt on her life? He wanted to ask her these questions, to help her find her answers, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Linda wasn't ready to face her past, not yet. Still, Saipho couldn't help but wonder what lay beyond the quiet life they had carved for themselves. Meanwhile, far away in a mansion hidden from the prying eyes of the village, Linda's stepmother, Nomsa, paced restlessly in front of a large portrait of her late husband. Her eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the room with impatience. It had been days since Linda disappeared, and despite her best efforts, no one had been able to track her down. Nomsa's frustration was beginning to show, and the atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. "I told you to be careful, Tolani," Nomsa snapped, her voice cold and sharp. Linda was supposed to disappear without a trace. Now, everyone is looking for her. What if they find out? What if she comes back with the police? Her husband, Tolani, a tall man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, looked up from the letter he had been reading. His brow furrowed with concern, but he kept his voice calm. "Don't worry, Nomsa. No one will find her. The men I hired made sure of that. Linda is gone, and she's not coming back." Nomsa's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that held no warmth, only calculation. She had never liked Linda. The girl's presence in their home had always been a thorn in her side, a constant reminder of her late husband's first family. But it wasn't just the girl's presence that irked her, it was the inheritance. Nomsa's eyes glinted with greed as she thought of the fortune that Linda was set to inherit. If only Linda were out of the picture, Nomsa and Tolani would have access to it all. "The sooner she's gone, the better," Nomsa muttered under her breath. "Then we can live as we should, no more shadows of the past. Just us." Back at Saipho's cabin, the air was thick with unease. Over the past few days, Saipho had started noticing strange things, faint noises coming from the woods late at night, shadows moving outside the windows, and an unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. At first, he brushed it off, telling himself it was just his imagination or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But as time went on, the unease grew. One evening, while returning from a trip to the market, Saipho noticed a group of unfamiliar faces gathered in the village square. They looked like ordinary travelers, but there was something about them that set his instincts on edge. They would often glance toward his cabin, their eyes lingering for just a moment too long. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was becoming impossible to ignore. Saipho's heart began to race as he thought about Linda. She was still fragile, still so vulnerable. What if these people were part of the group that had tried to hurt her? What if they were coming for her again? The thought of Linda being in danger once more made Saipho's blood run cold. He had promised to protect her, but he didn't know who to trust. He didn't know who was behind these strange figures or what their intentions were. That night, Saipho lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that the danger Linda had escaped from wasn't over. His protective instincts flared, and he knew that he couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. But what if he was wrong? What if the danger was just in his head? If he acted too soon, he could make a mistake that would put them both at risk. Yet, if he didn't act quickly enough, he might lose her forever. The next day, Saipho spoke to Linda about the strange figures he had seen. She listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they're after me again?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Saipho hesitated, his eyes flickering with concern. "I don't know. But I think it's time we find out who's behind this. You deserve to know the truth about what happened to you." Linda's face hardened with resolve. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of her old strength. She wasn't going to hide from her past any longer. Whatever secrets it held, she would face them head-on. And together, she and Saipho would uncover the lies that had haunted her life. The truth unveiled. The river, a constant presence in Saipho's life, had become a place of solace for Linda too. It was there, on a quiet afternoon, that she sat by the water's edge, her legs drawn to her chest as the cool breeze played with her hair. Her thoughts were tangled, her mind a labyrinth of fragmented memories, each piece slipping through her fingers before she could fully grasp it. But the river, with its gentle flow, had a way of quieting her restless mind, offering a rare moment of peace. As she stared into the water, her gaze was distant, the sound of the river's flow soothing her troubled soul. But then, unexpectedly, a flood of memories hit her like a tidal wave. It was as if the dam that had been holding her past back had finally burst, and all at once, the images and voices returned. She saw flashes of her childhood, a time when her family had been whole. She remembered her father's gentle voice, the way he would laugh and tell her stories. But that warmth had been overshadowed by someone else, the cold, calculating presence of Nomsa, her stepmother. She could hear her voice, harsh and dismissive, her sharp words cutting through the air like a knife. Linda remembered the way Nomsa had always favored her own children, pushing Linda aside, making her feel like an outsider in her own home. She had always been cruel to her, finding fault in everything she did, belittling her at every turn. But it wasn't just the cruelty, it was the envy. Linda remembered how Nomsa's eyes would narrow whenever her father would praise her, or whenever someone mentioned her inheritance. The inheritance that Nomsa wanted for herself. The realization hit Linda like a blow to the chest. Nomsa, she was behind this. She wanted me gone, not just because of the way she treated me, but because of the money. The inheritance. The pieces of her past began to slot into place. The cruelty, the isolation, the coldness, it was all part of a larger, more sinister plan. She wasn't just the victim of a stepmother's cruelty. She was the victim of a plot to take her life so that Nomsa and her husband, Toloni, could get their hands on her inheritance. Linda's heart raced as the memories continued to flood back. She could see it now, the way Nomsa had always undermined her, how she had been so desperate to push her out of the picture. But now Linda knew the truth. It wasn't just jealousy. It was greed. And that greed had almost cost her everything. Later that evening, when Saipho returned to the cabin, he found Linda sitting by the fire, her expression far away, as though she had been lost in thought for hours. She looked up when he entered, and he could see the storm in her eyes, the realization that she was no longer the same woman who had arrived at his doorstep weeks ago. "I remember," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I remember everything." Saipho set down the basket of fish he had brought with him, his eyes narrowing with concern. "Everything?" Linda nodded, her eyes unwavering. "Nomsa, my stepmother. She's the one who tried to kill me. She's the one behind this whole thing, Saipho. She wanted me gone, so she and Toloni could have everything." Saipho's heart sank. He had suspected that Linda's past was more complicated than she had let on, but hearing the truth come from her lips made it all the more real. "I'm so sorry, Linda," he said quietly. "I had no idea how deep this ran." Linda shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Neither did I. I thought it was just jealousy, but now I know, it was about the money. My father's inheritance. She paused, the weight of the words settling in. They were willing to kill me for it. The anger that had been simmering inside Linda since she had first woken up, confused and vulnerable, now flared into a roaring fire. She stood up, pacing the small room, her fist clenched. "I'm going to make them pay," she said, her voice trembling with fury but full of conviction. "I'm going to get my life back. I won't let them get away with this." Saipho stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "Linda, I know how angry you must feel. But this is dangerous. You're not alone in this, but you need to be careful. We don't know what they are capable of." Linda turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a fire that he had never seen before. "I don't care about the danger," she said, her voice steady. "They took everything from me. They tried to end my life, and they almost succeeded. If I have to fight them, I will. I will do whatever it takes to make sure they never hurt anyone again." Saipho's heart ached for her. He knew that her pain ran deep, but he also saw the strength that had been buried inside her, waiting for the right moment to rise up. He couldn't stop her, he wouldn't even try. He had seen enough of her courage to know that she would go to whatever lengths were necessary to confront the evil that had been lurking in her life for so long. "I'll help you," Saipho said, his voice soft but resolute. "I'll help you find them, and I'll stand by your side, no matter what. But we have to be smart about this." Linda nodded, grateful for his support, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. "We'll be smart. But we'll also be relentless." That night, as Linda lay in bed, her mind raced. She could no longer be the victim. She had been given a second chance at life, and she would make sure that it counted. Nomsa and Tolani might have thought that they could break her, but they had underestimated her strength, her resilience. They had underestimated what it meant to mess with someone who had nothing left to lose. Tomorrow, she would take the first step toward reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her future. No longer would she allow fear or uncertainty to control her. The truth had been unveiled, and with it came the power to change everything. And Linda knew one thing for certain: no matter how dark the path ahead, she would walk it without fear. A new hope. The morning was cool and crisp as Linda stood at the edge of Saipho's cabin, gazing down the path that would lead her back to the village. It felt like a lifetime since she had first arrived here, vulnerable and afraid, with no memory of who she was or where she came from. But now, as the sun rose behind her, she felt a fire burning in her chest, one that would not be extinguished until she had confronted the people who had stolen her future and tried to destroy her. Saipho stood beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. He had promised to support her, and now, as they prepared to face the people who had betrayed her, she knew that she wasn't alone. "Are you ready?" Saipho asked quietly, his voice gentle but filled with resolve. Linda nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant village. "I have to do this. It's the only way to move forward." With one last glance at the peaceful river and the cabin that had been her refuge, Linda set off down the path, Saipho by her side. The road ahead was uncertain, but her steps were sure. She had found the strength to confront her past, and now it was time to take back what was hers. As they neared the village, Saipho broke the silence that had settled between them. "Linda, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. Linda turned to him, sensing the weight in his words. "What is it, Saipho?" He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, his gaze steady. "I've been through something similar. When I was young, my own family was torn apart by greed and lies. My father's brothers tried to steal everything he had, and they even tried to take my life. I understand what it feels like to be betrayed by the people you should trust the most." Linda listened intently, feeling a deep connection to Saipho's story. "I had no idea. You never told me. I didn't want to burden you with my past," Saifo said, his eyes softening. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Whatever happens, I'll stand by you. I'll help you in any way I can. We'll take down Nomsa and Tolani together. Lindao's heart swelled with gratitude. Saifo's strength, his quiet wisdom, and his loyalty had been a constant source of support for her since the moment she had arrived at his doorstep. She had never imagined that anyone could care so deeply for her, especially after everything she had been through. And yet, Saifo had proven time and again that he was a true ally. Thank you, Saifo, Linda said, her voice filled with emotion. I couldn't do this without you. When they finally reached the village, Linda felt a wave of fear wash over her. This was the place where it had all started, the place where she had been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love her. But as she stood there, her shoulders squared and her back straight, she knew that this time, she was in control. They made their way to Nomsa and Tolani's mansion, the place where Linda had once been a prisoner, and now, it would be the place where she would confront her past head-on. The mansion loomed in front of them, dark and imposing, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to enter. Linda took a deep breath and walked toward the door. Saifo followed closely behind, his presence a steady reminder that she didn't have to face this alone. As they entered the mansion, Nomsa and Tolani were waiting for them, their expressions cold and calculating. Nomsa's eyes flickered with surprise when she saw Linda standing before her, alive, defiant, and unbroken. You! Nomsa spat, her voice dripping with venom. How dare you return here? Linda stood tall, her voice unwavering. You tried to kill me, Nomsa. You thought I would disappear, that I would never return. But I'm not gone. And I'm not going to let you get away with what you've done. Tolani stepped forward, his face hard. You don't understand, Linda. This was never about you. It was about survival. We needed the money, and you were in the way. Linda's hands clenched into fists, her anger rising. You murdered my father. You destroyed everything. And now, you're trying to take what's mine. Nomsa's lips curled into a smile, but it was a cruel, twisted smile. You think you can stop us? You think anyone will believe you? You're nothing. You always were. But Linda didn't flinch. She had found her voice, and now, she was going to make sure that the truth came to light. No, she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. I'm not nothing. I'm stronger than you think. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth about what you've done. The confrontation took an unexpected turn when the police, who had been secretly investigating Nomsa and Tolani's activities for months, arrived just in time. Saifo had contacted them, gathering evidence of their corruption and deceit. With their help, Linda was able to expose the full extent of Nomsa and Tolani's plot. As the authorities took Nomsa and Tolani into custody, Linda stood tall, her heart pounding with relief. It was over. They had been defeated. But the victory wasn't just about bringing Nomsa and Tolani to justice. It was about reclaiming her life, her future, and her place in the world. Linda had faced the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. With Saifo by her side, Linda walked away from the mansion, leaving behind the ghost of her past. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the village as she looked ahead to the future, a future she would build on her own terms. Linda had found her strength, and now, she was free.